read through the first couple of chapters of 1 John, and you'll be ready for next week. Today, on the other hand, we're going to conclude the Gospel of John in our reading. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, we are always grateful to be gathered around your good news. May it inspire our lives and our discipleship through Christ our Lord. Amen. So, come on in. Yes. So, a lot of people will talk about the Bible as the answer, that the Bible provides answers to more important to our questions about life and faith. And I think it's really important to ask. Let's see. Thanks. That organ does make a sound, doesn't it? Man.
I think they planned.
Some of you may have heard me say this before, but I really want to reiterate it. When we look at chapter 20 and 21 of the Gospel of John, let's ask ourselves a simple question. If this is the answer, well, what was the question? You know, what were the questions that prompted the writer of this book to narrate this story in such a manner? And I'm going to just throw that out to you before we read it and look at it. What do you suppose were the questions that the early church had that these two chapters sort of try to answer? What kind of questions would they have had? Come here, Kathy. When they asked questions about what happened to Jesus after his death.
What did he say?
What did they say? Good. Literally, what did they say? Yeah, okay. What other questions would they have had?
What are all these people in authority having to say?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
As an old hippie, that's
Yeah. Well, I want to suggest a couple of questions that were in the minds of the readers. The first question was, how did anyone in our faith community discover that Jesus was raised from the dead? Who discovered it? How did they discover it? What was said? What was narrated in this event? And who were they? And what did they see? What did they experience? And in chapter 20, the big question is, come in, Chrissy. The big question is, can you believe this report if you didn't see it yourself? Let me say it again. Can you believe this report if you didn't see it yourself? And so the Thomas narrative is going to play into that question. And also, I think part of the issue is, were these unique experiences given to only a few that were not going to be repeated? And at least the way the Gospel of John envisions it, these are one-off. These are unique experiences that are not necessarily going to be replayed. And you get a hint of that in Jesus' interaction with Thomas, which we'll talk about in a moment. So I think that's what chapter 20, those are the questions. Who saw this? What was it like? What did they say? What did they do? And then what happens if you're not an eyewitness to all these events that are narrated? So that's chapter 20. And when we move to chapter 21, it's a different sort of question. And the question goes like this. What happens when someone who has denied Jesus 3 times interacts with Jesus again? Is there some kind of forgiveness? Is there some kind of recommissioning? What does that look like? And then furthermore, Jesus said he's coming back, but some of our leaders are dying. Some of our basic fundamental leaders are dying. And can we be sure that Jesus is really coming when we're losing all of our leadership? And what happens to us when we lose our leaders? And John 21 attempts to answer that question, because you'll get a sense in chapter 21 that it's dealing with both the death of Peter and the death of the beloved disciple. So losing your leadership needs to be addressed. So chapter 20 and chapter 21 are really asking very, very different questions. And as we look at this reading today, you can see that most people, including N.T. Wright, believe that the Gospel of John originally ended at the end of 20, as we'll see in just a moment. And chapter 21 is kind of an add-on, because why? The early church was losing its leadership. They were dying. And then what? Does that make sense to everybody? So it's really important to ask the right questions as you go into a reading of the text, okay? Now, the question that everybody raises to the Gospel of John and also the other three Gospels is this: why would you have as your primary witness to the resurrection of Jesus a woman or women, if you're in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, But in John, you'll notice it's a singular woman. Now, back up for a second. John has a penchant for giving you individual dialogues of Jesus and an individual. Think back to the gospel. We had an individual dialogue with Nicodemus at night, right? We had an individual dialogue with Jesus and the Samaritan woman, right? We end up having something of an individual dialogue between Jesus and the man born blind, right? And then we have this unique individual dialogue between Jesus and Pilate, right? Kind of off to the side. John loves individual dialogues. And so he gives us not Mary and her friends, but Mary by herself, because that's John's tendency, right? So early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. The most surprising part of this little narrative is, so they just went home. It's Easter morning, we see the empty tomb. Okay, I'm gonna go home. I mean, you're supposed to go, what? When you read that text, but we're so used to this text that it doesn't surprise us. You shouldn't be surprised, but Now, what really should surprise you is that Mary Magdalene goes there first, right? And she's alone, and when she goes in, the stone is already rolled back. Remember in the synoptics, there's some issues about the stone and being rolled back, etc. But it's already rolled back. And she goes in and she sees that the tomb is actually not empty. There's some grave clothes, right? And they're nicely rolled up, But remember, what makes those grave clothes so astonishing is that it appears to be, imagine a kind of cocoon-like, configuration, because the body's been wrapped like this, and the body has sort of gone out of it, but the wrappings are still there. So those of
That
you,
all comes after what you just read. That's-
yeah,
She just ran off when she
Yep.
saw the stone out of the way.
that,
I told him the stone is gone.
it's gone, yeah. And here's the point, when they look in there, that is Peter and the beloved disciple, they actually see this thing. And those of you who studied the Turin Shroud, have you ever studied the Turin Shroud? What's weird about the Turin Shroud is many things, but one is it's laid out flat. So automatically you realize that's not what was in the tomb. It's a kind of a cocoon-like structure, and the face mask is rolled up nicely onto the side. So the Turin Shroud has nothing to do with John 20. It's utterly irrelevant to it. Okay. So they see it, but they don't quite believe, they don't quite know what they're looking at, right? Which is to say, I think, that grave clothes alone can't do it. Grave clothes alone are not going to convince you that this remarkable thing has happened. They're astonished, but they're not convinced, right? So they go back home. Mary Magdalene hangs around the tomb, right? And let's see what happens. Yes, go ahead. Sure.
Can you tell me what it is?
Oh, I'm looking at John 20. Yeah. And I just read the first 10 verses. Yeah. Okay. So at this point, the disciples go home. And by the way, this is going to be parallel in 21. They go back to their home base in 21, which is fishing. When the disciples don't understand something, they just go back to what they're used to, right? But Mary hangs around. Verse 11. Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. Now she's finally going to look into the tomb. And what does she see? It's not an empty tomb. She saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and other at the foot. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And this is what she should have said: "Who are y'all?" What?
Was she prepared?
Yeah. Plural is you all. And no, she just goes, right, well, listen, they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him. And when she said this, she turned around. So they don't answer. She turns around and she saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, same thing the angel said, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, I love that, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, it's kind of like, here's the tone would be, "Mary." That's kind of when your parents caught you red-handed. "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni." Actually, it's mistranslated. Rabboni with an I at the end means my teacher. So the Greek doesn't quite catch it. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." And Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Now, if this were Luke, the next line would be what? They thought it was an idle tale, right? This is what Luke says when the women tell them, right? But you don't get that in John. Okay, so this is a wonderful scene. And by the way, this replicates the Luke 24, the road to Emmaus, right? That you don't know who this companion is until Christ himself reveals himself, I guess, And when she does recognize him, then she wants to cling to him. The Greek it's a kind of clinging. I'm going to hold you here for myself, and I'm not going to let them steal you away ever again. But That's not Jesus' role at this point. He's going to the Father, he says. So Mary, don't cling to me. You can't cling to me in this way that you're doing this. This is a great scene. This is in the Old Testament, it's called Epiphany scenes, when you have an experience of living the Holy One in your midst. It's an epiphany. And it ends with her going to tell the disciples, hey guys, he is alive and I saw him. Now again, if you're in the other Gospels, the other disciples are not going to believe this, right? But then, what does the text do? It doesn't have them run back to the tomb. It has them that evening gathering in an upper room, a kind of a safe house, if you will. And here's what it says, 2019. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And after he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. And then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. So at least in the Gospel of John, the Pentecost for the disciples gathered is Easter night. That night they received the Spirit when he breathes upon them. It's a wonderful phrase. And I've often wondered why John sets it up like this, because as you remember in the Synoptics and in Luke especially, the Spirit descends on Pentecost, which is 40, 50 days later, right? But here they receive the Spirit immediately. And I think the reason that John does that, well, why would you think John does that? Why would John do a Pentecost event, so to speak, on Easter night? Now, this is not for the 3,000 at Pentecost. This is just for a few scared guys in an upper room, right? Why would he do that?
Recommissioning like you, yes.
Pardon?
He's recommissioning, he's
Yeah.
assigning them, you know.
Very good. Bruce says it's a kind of recommissioning, and he says, receive the Spirit, then I send you. So it has a recommissioning kind of quality, doesn't it? Yeah. What do you make of this phrase, if you forgive the sins of some, but if you don't forgive? Have you ever thought about the disciples having the power not to forgive? Puzzling, isn't it? Given what they've done. You know, wouldn't you want there to be a wideness in God's mercy? But I've often thought that maybe what's going on here is that the early church realized that the disciples had to set up sort of some boundaries for what was permissible and not permissible in the early Christian community. And when you say, no, that's not permitted, that's kind of like the 10 Commandments. You know, 10 Commandments, think of the 10 Commandments, the 2 tablets. You have 2 things that you said that you're to do. You're to honor the Sabbath and honor your parents. And then it lists 8 things that are outside the realm of the community that should never be allowed in. You know, to take the Lord's name in vain, to steal, to commit murder, etc. So think of the 10 Commandments as 2 positives and 8 things excluded. And it seems to me there's something similar going on here in John 20. What's acceptable and what's not. Now, for instance, we will get in Paul's letter all kinds of things that end up not being acceptable within the Christian community. Like, for instance, having sex with your mother-in-law. That would be 1 Corinthians 5. That's not going to work in the Christian community. But I don't know, what do y'all think? If you retain the sins of some, they will be retained. Have you ever thought about that as a role?
I was very confused by it.
Huh?
I was very confused by that.
Yeah, it is, yeah. I think it may be lining out what's acceptable and not acceptable, I think, in the Christian community. And we'll get more of that, by the way, in 1 John. In 1 John, in 2nd and 3rd John, what becomes not acceptable is someone saying that Jesus did not come in the flesh. We'll see that that becomes a non-starter.
When he wrote this, which was, what, 20 years after Christ died?
It may be as much as 60.
Were Peter and Paul not in a confrontational attitude toward one another?
When this was written, Peter and Paul had been dead probably 30 years.
But they're like you had Pauline disciples,
Yes.
and Peter's disciples.
Yes.
They were not
They-
always compatible.
I think the point is that the early church had enormous number of different disagreements, right? And they really were, it was never a golden age of pure unity in the early church, as much as I wish there were. It never happened.
And every community always has kind of a spoken and assumed regulations.
Spoken and assumed regulations. And I think one of the biggest issues that the early church faced, of course, was the issue of, do you have to become a Jew first before you can become a Christian? And that one they finally settled, saying, no, you don't have to become a Jew first before you become a Christian. So there were disagreements, for sure. But it's not something we ever talk about very much, that the part of the Spirit being given to the disciples is to kind of discern what's forgivable and what's outside the pale. You know what I mean? Well, let me give you another one. John, the Gospel of John does not give us Judas committing suicide. You get that in Matthew and you get it in Acts. Okay. What if Judas had come back, Easter and said, guys, I've made a terrible mistake,
I'm still in the club.
Yeah. Can I get up there in your room with you guys? No, I mean, it's kind of an important question because the early church faced issues of leaders who failed, and should they be reinstated into leadership or not? I mean, they can be forgiven, but should they be reinstated into leadership issues?
Colin said that, I'd say maybe a little too soon.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Until next year.
Yeah, right. Check back with us next year, Judas.
In other words, these guys get to accept them into society, and
Yeah,
maybe Jesus gets to have
maybe so.
the
Yeah.
final say in the afterlife.
There you go. Okay, last scene in 20, and here's the question. What if you didn't see this? What if you didn't experience this? John 20:24. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails in my hands in the side, I will not believe. A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, once again, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe. And Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. The highest Christology, by the way, in the New Testament. Jesus said to him, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. So I think the Gospel of John is saying, yes, it was a unique experience for a very small number of people to see the risen Christ. But blessed are all those who've not seen, which puts like 99.999999999 infinity number of Christians that we've not seen. Blessed are you when you believe anyway. And how does belief happen? Well, the last verse of John, the last two verses. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. So at the very end of his original ending, it goes like this. Belief comes from hearing the story and believing, from trusting it, that you didn't see it like Thomas, but yet you could still believe. So the book ends on this very hopeful note that the word becomes flesh, can become the word written, and then the word spoken. And it'll be still believed in any format. By the way, Karl Barth, famous Reformed theologian, said that the word of God has three forms. The word made flesh, Jesus, the word written in scripture, and the word spoken in teaching and preaching. And so that quote threefold form of the word is kind of a reformed notion of the word. So let's stop for a second. What do you think of chapter 20? Question is, what happened? Who saw it? How did they respond? And then what if you don't get to see Jesus with the nail prints in his hands and his side? Can you still believe? Do you think that chapter answers it pretty well? What do you think?
Whether you believe is your choice.
Yeah. Say it again.
What you believe is your choice.
It is your choice. And he keeps telling us, you don't get to see it the way Thomas saw it, but you can still believe, right?
I read somewhere a while back, I can't remember. I can't remember this moment, but said the difference between faith and belief. Like believing is when someone else does the thinking. So it's like when you read the story, like you have to, like if you didn't see it, you have to have faith in it and your own understanding. Well, not making it your own understanding.
Right.
You have to have your own faith. Like it comes into play.
Yeah. The word pisteo in Greek can be translated either faith or belief, either one. I think the phrase I've thought about for a lot is you kind of catch faith from other people, but it's got to be your faith. Somebody might infect you with it a little bit.
Yeah.
You got to get sick with it yourself. Or something like that. There you go. Okay, so that's 20. So let's switch to 21. Okay, now here is a different set of questions, and I think this chapter 21 was added later after the God. Does this sound like the ending of a gospel? But these are written so that you may believe. Does that kind of sound like an ending?
Yes, the purpose of the book is,
Yeah.
it would be, like the explanation.
It's like the end, But 21 shifts the whole story from Jerusalem back to Galilee. And by the way, in Matthew, you end up in Galilee on a mountaintop, right? And in Mark, we're told to go to Galilee, meet Jesus, but it's never narrated. John gets us back to Galilee. And guess what? They go out fishing all night long, and Peter and all his pals. And when you start this chapter, you don't get the impression from just reading it that there had been prior resurrection appearances. It's as though the story ended badly in Jerusalem. They've gone home. If you didn't have chapter 20 and you only had chapter 21, let me just start it off here and tell me if this presupposes any prior resurrection narratives. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Now, the only hint that there have been previous appearances is the word again. Otherwise, this story is told like this will be a first for them. But the gospel writer wants to make it the third, and you'll see that in a moment. So they get out there and they're fishing and they've not caught a thing all night long. And then someone on the seashore says, hey, how's the fishing? And they go, not a thing. Try it on the other side of the boat. And they cast their net in there, and there's so many fish, he tells us later, 153. And by the way, scholars have wondered for years what 153 is supposed to mean. Nobody knows. You could make it up. You could make up 153 mythology for yourself.
How many days was he here?
Well, 360 or so, if they had lunar calendars. Yeah, well, 153, I tell you, scholars have not gotten any closer to it than we are.
Numerology is falling. into
Numerology,
disuse.
yeah. Let's not go there. So this is what's great. The beloved disciple sees that it's actually Jesus because he reveals himself by word, right? And then the text says is that Peter put on some clothes for he was naked. Now, I may have told y'all that I never understood this story until I went to the Sea of Galilee in the dead of summer. The Sea of Galilee is about 400 to 500 feet below sea level, okay? And then the Dead Sea is 1,200 feet below sea level. So those of you who've been to the Grand Canyon, right? And you go way down, it gets hotter and hot, all that stuff. Well, I was there and it was blazing hot, it really was. And I finally understood the reason he was working without any clothes, it was hot. The answer is he was hot. So there, if you're wondering about why he's working naked, it was hot, okay. And he jumps in and they drag the net ashore, and starting in verse 9, 21:9, when they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there. And by the way, N.T. Wright makes a big deal that the word charcoal fire is identical to chapter 18, where Peter's around a charcoal fire and denies him 3 times. It's exactly the same word. It was there, and there was fish on it and bread. Jesus is already cooking. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Isn't that charming? Yeah, come, have breakfast. I love that. Now, none of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. And this was now the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. By the way, in the early church, it was not uncommon at the Eucharist, the communion service, to have bread and wine and fish. And it goes back to that, right? So I would say our communion services would be enhanced with some fish. Fish nuggets, maybe, every Sunday.
Goldfish.
Yeah, go fish. Yeah, right. And maybe have a little mural with 153 fish, behind the communion text. This is church art we've not conceived of yet. Okay.
Well, why don't you produce that?
Do I?
Why don't you produce that?
Yeah, right.
Right.
I'm gonna call Rome tomorrow and see if they'll go along with it. But bread and fish and wine, wouldn't that be I think it'd be an enhancer actually to the communion service. So here we go. Now we're at the point of this story. The point of the story is Peter and the beloved disciple, and the perspective of this chapter, going back to when it was written in the 90s. The perspective of this chapter is that both Peter and the beloved disciple have died. So let's read it thinking that. When they had finished breakfast, after breakfast, little speech. Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John. So he's going to ask him 3 times, do you love me? And it's exactly the same 3 denials with the corresponding 3 yeses. And it's a commissioning service, right? Feed my sheep, tend my lambs, take care of my people. And then in verse 18, he says, very truly, I tell you, when you, Peter, were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. He said this is in parenthesis, to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. And after that, he said to him, follow me. So Peter is now going to follow Christ even to his death. And remember what Peter had said earlier, I will go with you to Jerusalem. I'll go to jail with you. I'll die with you, right? Well, now Jesus extends that in the future. It says, well, now you will do this. That is your destiny. And the writer wants us to know that's how Peter did die. So the assumption in this chapter is Peter's already gone. He's no longer with us. But then what's so great about this is that now he's going to turn his attention to the beloved disciple. And the question will be what? Well, what about him? Now, those of you who have brothers and sisters, did any of you ever say about your sister, well, what about her? You tell me I can't do it. What about her? You never did that, did you, Bruce? But you did it about Bruce, right? What about Bruce?
We had 5 of us, there was a lot of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. What about Bruce? What about that? So here's the story. So Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved. But by the way, we never know who this disciple is. A lot of tradition says it's John, the younger brother of James and John, but we just don't know. And by the way, I've often said, if the writer of the Gospel of John chooses not to name him, why is it we choose to name him? Right? Can't we just stay with beloved disciple? Just live with it. Okay. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? And when Jesus saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? Now, is the implication here is, okay, I'm going to die a death I don't want. Well, what about him? And we're not quite sure what the implication is, but I think that's probably what Peter had in mind. And Jesus said, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if it is my will. So what's going on there? It's correcting this notion that the beloved disciple would still be alive when Jesus returned. Okay, wait, the beloved disciple died. Does that mean Jesus made a promise that he didn't keep? Is that the implication? I think so. But notice what the writer says. If is very different than when. And in Greek, by the way, if and when are different words. The same way they are in English. Isn't that a charming little aside that both of these leaders are now gone? Peter has died. The beloved disciple has died. But what? Carry on, I think is the implication. And so this is the finale, 24. Now, I want to ask you who this disciple is in this verse. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. That's a confusing verse in English and in Greek. notice that the writer of this gospel is talking about his testimony, right? He's not talking about, I wrote this, but he wrote it. Somebody else wrote it. And so 24 is very confusing. A lot of people want to make it as though the beloved disciple, the John, and the gospel writer are all one person. But there's that sentence right there tells you it's a different person he's pointing to. His testimony is true. Y'all get that? Okay. So here's the finale. But there are many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Pretty cool ending, huh? Okay. So what do you make of this when the church gets anxious about its leaders dying? They think, well, what? We're done. You know, we're doomed. We can't possibly go on. I've often thought that every time a significant church leader dies, John 21 is the chapter that should be read, because there's more to come to the story. And just because Peter and the beloved disciple are gone doesn't mean that the church throws up its hands and says, well, we're done for, you know. Yeah. When I was at Austin Seminary, the most significant, most influential teacher on campus was Stuart Curry. And Stuart Curry was, when I say Renaissance man, I really honestly mean Renaissance man. He would walk around, when you're walking with him on the campus, he would look at a plant and he would give you its Latin name. And then he would start talking about its growing patterns and what it does, et cetera. And then you'd walk into a building and he'd talk about the architecture and who was the architects that designed this. I mean, he was unbelievably erudite. And the old joke was that sometimes people would ask Stuart, well, how do you know that? He says, I read it in the library. And then people would add, and you've read the library, you know. This is the kind of guy he was. Well, when I was at Austin Seminary, my last semester there, Stuart Curry died unexpectedly. He played racquetball a lot with other faculty members. And I'll never forget going to the seminary chapel where people gathered. And one of the things that was said in that memorial service was, how can the seminary move forward without Stuart Curry? Stuart Curry was a force of nature, and he was a force in that seminary. And you know what? We named the men's dorm after him, Stuart Curry Hall, and we moved forward. That was 40 years ago. And we're doing fine. Thank you very much. Thanks be to God. And we're dedicating in January a new library, which should be really nice, considering that it costs $52 million, you know. And so the seminary didn't just die with Stuart Curry. Is as important as he was. And by the way, his uncle had been the president of the seminary before him. So when he died, it was the first time there had not been a Curry at Austin Seminary in like 3 or 4 decades. So I don't know. To me, that's what John 21 is trying to say.
And it's followed by Acts, right? So.
Yeah, that's right. Acts is more to come, right? Right. So what do y'all think? Just let's stop for a second. And John, the Gospel of John. What's been surprising for you? What's been interesting for you? What did you not expect? What did you have confirmed for you in the study of the Gospel of John? Oh, I'm sorry.
One of that where Mary Magdalene met Jesus, and you know, like Mary, you know.
Yeah, Mary.
And I always thought he said it in a very low, That's just me, and I've always thought that in my whole life.
And you're perfectly right.
It was very
Yeah.
loving
So,
when
dude,
he said it.
the good news is that hardly ever does the Bible tell you the tone in
Right.
which the folks talk. you
Well,
know?
and you interpret it.
Yeah, exactly,
You
yeah.
interpret it that way,
Yeah.
since my child.
Yeah. I just kind of like, Mary. But, like.
But when you asked the question about a woman finding.
Yeah.
I was thinking, where is Deb Rebstock when?
Yeah, they were Dad, right. Dad could be here. Well, and it's really a huge affirmation. Two of the most significant individual conversations Jesus has in the Gospel of John are actually three are with women. The Samaritan woman at the well, Mary and Martha saying, "Where have you been, Buster? Lazarus is dead." And then with Mary Magdalene. So he puts three very important conversations. Now, the way Luke does it is he puts that conversation with Mary, the mother of Jesus, at the beginning, of the gospel. And remember too, that in the crucifixion scene in John, it's the women and the beloved disciple who are there at his death. So the women play a very important role, actually, in the Gospel of John. Yes.
I think for me, this gospel in a lot of ways makes the other actors into more real people.
Yes.
That they have flaws. and
Yes.
It's like when life gets tough, they go fishing.
Yeah.
Because that's that's like, let's go back to work. We don't know what else to do.
That's right.
And I think that there's a lot of us in them. And the other thing, like this last chapter that's possibly added on chapter, it would feel much more comfortable if it was in Acts. If they just like kind of moved it over there
In Acts. Yeah.
into that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I never thought about that. Yeah.
Because it's kind of in the vein of
Yes.
Job, and then what happened?
And then the rest of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I would say is that the Gospel of John probably does a better job of giving full dimension to the characters in the gospel, much better certainly than Mark. Mark is so fast, it's just like, Mark has the word euthus immediately about 40 times, and Jesus is just running through Mark, and you can hardly catch up with him, right? But in John, you kind of sit there for a little bit and you see this woman at the well, and you get she's a woman with a checkered past, and on it goes. Nicodemus is a guy that is afraid, but he's still intrigued by Jesus. Then in chapter 7, he pops up again and says, but we need to give a fair trial to this guy. And then he pops up again in 19 when he goes with Joseph of Arimathea to bury the body. I mean, he's coming out. So you have Nicodemus going through the whole book. But I think the best character sketch of all, in my opinion, is John 9, the man born blind, who starts literally at like zero. He has nothing, right? He can't see. He's a beggar. And by the end of the chapter, he is a sardonic witness to Jesus and taking on the religious leaders who, by the way, end up throwing him out of the synagogue. And that's okay, because when he meets Jesus, that's okay, I just think that the character sketches in John are much better than the other gospels.
Well, even Mary and Martha after Lazarus
Yeah.
dies, and they come back and they're pretty
They
annoyed
are annoyed.
that you let this happen. If you come when we asked you to, our brother wouldn't be dead. But they're like real people.
Real people.
They're not like cardboard people.
They're not cardboard people. And let me just say this. Think about these long speeches in the Gospel of John that Jesus himself gives. I mean, there's nothing like it in the Synoptic Gospels. Nothing. The only thing that's even close would be maybe the Sermon on the Mount. But these long, self-revealing sort of dialogues that Jesus has, that's of a different quality entirely than the synoptic gospels, right? So I think it's one of the reasons so many people love the Gospel of John, and why it's year after year after year, they do all these polls of Christians, Gallup polls and all the rest. John is always is the favorite gospel of Christians, right?
Maybe he was better educated.
Pardon?
Maybe he was better educated.
Maybe so. I mean, his Greek is, I may have told y'all this, the Greek in the Gospel of John is the easiest Greek of the four Gospels. And if you already knew the Greek alphabet, and some of you maybe went to fraternity sorority rushes, you know, the Greek alphabet. If you were to give me an hour, I could teach you enough grammar of Greek where you could translate the prologue to John. Literally, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I mean, it's as simple a Greek as you will find in the New Testament. And yet it's so profound in so many respects. It's poetic in so many respects.
It didn't strike me until today when you were talking about the story of Thomas.
Yeah.
That's sort of an example of you can't make the Gospels jive.
No.
Matthew has the story of Judas' suicide.
Yes.
John has the story of Thomas not being here.
Right.
The other two Gospels say that night Jesus appeared to the 11, which means one of them was there.
You're right. Yeah. Here's what I would say. The more you do a comparison contrast study of the four Gospels, the more you're amazed at how the early church was willing to say, well, let's just throw that all in there, you know, and let's don't try to fix it. And, you know, if people find little tensions within it, well, so be it, you know. And so what happened was, in the 2nd century, a Syrian Christian by the name of Tatian said, I'm bothered by all these differences. I'll just make one continuous narrative. So he wrote something called the Diatessaron, and dia means through, and tessaron means four. So through 4 Gospels, I'm going to give you one continuous narrative. And that was the gospel in the Syrian church, more or less, for 200 years, you know. And so the tendency in the church has been that we sort of subconsciously do diatessaron's ourselves. You know, we fix it. And my suggestion to you is, if the early church was okay with differences, then be okay with it. You know, don't try to fix these gospels. They are what they are, you know. And also I would say, when you're telling the story of the single most important affirmation about Jesus, that he's risen, and they tell it in such different ways that you can't fix, you have to say, well, clearly they were not colluding with each other. We can be certain of that. And by the way, they might not even know of other God. Now we know that Matthew and Luke knew about Mark. We're certain of that because they use him, right? But here's a question for you, and we'll end with this. Did the Gospel of John know anything about Matthew, Mark, and Luke? We really don't know. I mean, seriously, there's some things about the way the passion narrative is told that is similar in some respects to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But in the rest of the story, it is radically different. It is radically different, right? And it has a different theological take. So let's end the Gospel of John on this. Let's remember that in the Gospel of John, there is no Mount of Transfiguration, right? Where Jesus is glorified with Moses and Elijah, and the 3 disciples see this glory. In the Gospel of John, the glory of Jesus is from the beginning. When Jesus comes out of the Jordan River, you know, you can almost see them. We beheld his glory, glory of the only begotten. First miracle, Cana, we beheld his glory. So I've often said that for me, the Gospel of John is to glorify Jesus. The Jesus that almost has a halo, you know, there's a little element of that. And it's the highest Christology of all the Gospels because it starts with what? In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. And the Word became flesh. That's about as high a Christology. And John 20 ends it with a crescendo, my Lord and my God. Get it? You know, that stuff you don't get in the synoptic Gospels. That's not synoptic stuff. That's John. So I think that John is giving us this glorified Jesus who's assertive and strong and never in doubt. And church needed that in the 90s when they're getting thrown out of the synagogue and Rome is bearing down on their necks. They needed that kind of Jesus. And that's what the Gospel of John provided. Pretty amazing.